We will be discussing PAS 38 class. I've made initial discussions already with the other classes as to PAS 38. Now we'll have a more formal discussion on PAS 38 by going over the provisions provided in the standard itself. But I hope you've done your reading also on the Q&As provided in your textbook class, since basically the Q&As there are based on the contents of the standard. As always, class, the standards would begin with their objective. So if there's one thing you will have to know as to the objective of the standard class, PAS 38, understand that we are dealing with intangible assets. So that's the first thing we have to hurdle, class. What should be our understanding for the phrase or the account intangible assets? So very understandable, class. Intangible assets are assets that are not tangible. Okay. Meaning it cannot be perceived by your senses, class. Any asset that we cannot see, we cannot feel, we cannot hear can be considered as an intangible asset. However, I want you to understand, class, that just because an asset is not tangible doesn't mean it will be covered by PAS 38. So that should be the first takeaway for today, class. That just because an asset is not tangible, just because an asset is intangible, doesn't mean it will already be covered by PAS 38. In fact, class, PAS 38 is more of a standard of last resort. You only use PAS 38 for intangible assets that are not covered by any other standard. Make no mistake, PAS 38 applies only to intangible assets, but PAS 38 do not apply to all intangible assets. I'll repeat that, class. PAS 38 applies only to intangible assets, but PAS 38 does not apply to all intangible assets. So what kind of intangible assets then are governed or covered by PAS 38? Okay, and as I've mentioned earlier, PAS 38 will only apply to intangible assets that are not governed specifically by other standards, class. You'll have to understand, as I may have mentioned before, that assets can come in the form of rights, class. The best example would always be accounts receivable. Okay, and your accounts receivable represents the right to receive cash. Okay, and such right, class, is not tangible. Okay, you cannot see that right, but you know that such right exists. Okay, but even though we know accounts receivable are not tangible assets, even though that we know and understand that accounts receivable is an intangible asset, it is not governed by PAS 38, class, because a different standard applies specifically for accounts receivable. Your receivables, class, are governed by uh, PFRS 9, and to some extent, or other forms of receivable, class, could also be covered by uh, PAS 32. Okay, but at this point, I just want to make one thing clear, class, that PAS 38 applies only to intangible assets, but not all intangible assets are governed by PAS 38. PAS 38 applies only to intangible assets that are not governed specifically by another standard. That is why, class, when we proceed to the scope of the standard, class, uh, paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 are actually good sources for multiple choice question, class. You could be asked which of the following is not covered by PAS 38. Okay? And if you'll notice, class, the items provided in paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 here, class, are enumeration of items not covered by PAS 38. Because again, the application of PAS 38 is more of whatever is left, whatever is not covered, whatever is unregulated. So past 38 is more of a standard of last resort. It's the residual standard. So please take note of paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 of the standard class, because this would be a good source for a multiple choice question. Again, you will be asked which of the following is not covered by past 38. Now, you'll notice, class, that of all the items here that are being enumerated as being not covered by past 38, the standard always mention of another standard that will apply. So for example, here, paragraph 2b, class, past 38 does not apply to financial assets because financial assets, class, are governed by past 32 and PFRS 9. In paragraph 2c, recognition and measurement of exploration and evaluation assets, it also tells us to go to IFRS 6. And for paragraph 2d, class, expenditure in the development and extraction of mineral oils, natural gas, and similar non-regenerative resources. At this point, we've learned that this kind of asset is governed by PAS 16. If we go to paragraph 3, class, we have an intangible asset, but it is held for sale, class. And since it is held for sale, it will now be PAS 2 that will be applicable, class. For deferred tax assets, it is governed by PAS 12. For leases, it is governed by PFRS 16. For employee benefits, class, it is governed by PAS 19. Okay. If you'll notice, class, most of the enumerations in number 3 represents certain kind of right, class. Okay, and that's why they are mostly not visible or not tangible. Okay. Okay, you have goodwill, which would be covered by PFRS 3, insurance contracts or those contracts covered by PFRS 17. And even if you have other non-current assets, class, that are supposedly intangible, but since they are held for sale or held for disposal or held for distribution, class, then they will be covered by PFRS 5. So basically, class, my point is, if you will be asked as to what assets are governed by PAS 38, simply say that those intangible assets that are not governed specifically by another standard. Now, when you are asked, now when that comes out as a multiple choice question, class, it would help you to know whether a certain item or account is governed by PAS 38 if you are already aware of the other standards. Because if you are aware of the existence of the other standards, class, and you are aware that those standards apply to this specific item or account, then you would already be able to say that PAS 38 will not be applicable, class. Okay. So at this point, it's all right if you will be having a hard time remembering specifically those that are covered by PAS 38, but find comfort, class, in the fact that by the time you get to be familiar with the other standards, class, remembering or identifying those that are covered and not covered by PAS 38 will become a lot easier, class. Okay, so at this point, it's understandable. It's okay if you feel the need to actually memorize the enumeration in paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. But eventually, this would become very easy for you to identify, class, as you get to be familiar with the other standards.